I'm going to introduce Matt because Matt was once a student too. How many people in here are students? Okay, so most of you. So Matt came here originally in the summer of 2012 as a member of the NASA Aeronautics Academy. And Matt actually had a passion for and wanted to be in air traffic management then, correct? Somewhat. Okay, well, he acted like he did because he was a major player in the project that we had that summer. We had a 10-student team. They completed their project and they successfully demonstrated the hardware portion before they left, and they were here for 10 weeks, correct? So Matt then graduated in December, and then he came back, correct, for an internship. And while he was here, he applied for a job at the Cruise Systems branch, and he was hired. So within a year, he had a full-time job as a civil servant in the Cruise Systems branch, where he works now. Then in 2015, we had our first ever spring academy. That was an 8-student team, and they were here for the spring semester, but they had 2 separate projects. And one project was air traffic management, and Matt served as their technical lead. So I've known Matt for a long time. I respect and admire Matt. He is now a father. He just had a baby, right? Or his wife just had a baby? Is she a year, or yet? Is she a year old? Okay. So anyway, this is Matt Underwood, and I'm looking forward to hearing his talk with you guys.
Good. Mic check, good. Alrighty. So like Liz said, I'm Matt Underwood. I'm going to give a talk today on air traffic management in the National Airspace System. The talk, one takeaway I want you to have from the entire talk is complexity. The word's going to come up several times. I'm going to talk about it several times, just how complex it is to get a plane from point A to point B in our airspace today. So a little primer. Why do we even have a national airspace system? An overview of kind of the NAS, kind of by the numbers and some of the procedures. A brief history of air traffic control and how we got to the system that we have today. Looking at air traffic management as a separate discussion from the NAS. And then what does NASA do to support the development of the NAS into the future? So we'll start with a little world history. All right, so 200,000 years ago, we had kind of primitive humans. Weren't able to talk, but they kind of looked like us. Let's transform 50,000 years ago, we had language. We had the rise of language. So 13,000 years ago, we started domesticating animals and crops, and that domestication really led to innovation due to the nature of us moving away from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to more of a civilization. And then about 8,000 years ago, civilization as we think of today started. So note, most of the time that we've existed on this planet, we were cavemen and women, didn't really even talk to each other for a good portion of it. And really what that resulted in is tens of thousands of worlds on our planet. So let's skip about 9,800 years forward. We entered the 19th century at 6 miles an hour. Can anyone guess what that would be? Yeah, right. So horse and buggy, right? So that brought us from kind of tens of thousands to thousands of worlds. People were starting to get a little bit more mobile. We're into the 20th century at 60 miles an hour. Anyone with a guess there? Train, right? The steam locomotive. So that brought us from thousands of worlds down to hundreds of worlds. Again, we were getting more mobile and more mobile. 21st century, 600 miles an hour. Can anyone take a wild guess what that would be? Planes, right? So now we've gone from hundreds of individual worlds down to tens of worlds, all right? So the big takeaway from this is air transportation, right? Progressing towards kind of this unified one world for 100 years. So here's a little video. Every yellow dot that you see on this is an airplane. And you'll notice too that you can see dark and light. So right now it's light over in Asia, and daylight's starting to progress across Africa. And watch what happens to Europe here as daylight starts to get up to Europe. You see that explosion of traffic? Now let's watch the daylight come across the Atlantic and hit the continental United States here. And watch what happens to the traffic numbers here. Right, so as daylight's hit the East Coast, and the East Coast has a bunch of traffic now, and it's just progressing right across the country. West Coast is in sunlight now. And look at all those aircraft over the United States right now. So, with all those flights, and this is just one day, how do we manage all of them? Well, that's what the National Airspace System is. Right, so the definition is the airspace, the navigation facilities, the airports, along with all the associated information services, rules, regulations, et cetera, that allow planes to get from point A to point B. We operate in what's called a hub and spoke system. So hubs are major airports, Atlanta, Dulles up in DC, San Francisco, LAX, Denver. And then spokes are those airports kind of around them. You can think Norfolk is one, Patrick Henry, Richmond. So typically the way that flights operate is from a spoke. If you're lucky and live next to a hub, you guys get to go hub to hub. But typically for the majority of Americans, it's from a spoke to a hub to a hub, and from a hub to a spoke. Airspace over the United States is classified into different types. Associated with each type is a set of flight rules and different requirements for entering the airspace. So here's a nice diagram that the FAA put together that helps define what the airspace types are. So I'm just going to go over this in brief detail. There will be a test after this, so I hope everyone can remember. Class A up here at the top. I don't know if my laser pointer is working that well. Let's see if the good old mouse will work. All right, Class A up here at the top is everything above 18,000 feet up to what's called flight level 600. So flight level is a term used to talk about altitudes above 18,000 feet. Add 2 zeros to the end of the number, and that gets you the footage with standard pressure and temperature. This is done to have common altitude across the country for flights above that altitude, so you don't have to keep changing your barometer setting in your aircraft as you go from location to location to location. Everything above 18,000 uses standard pressure. Class A, pilots are required to hold an instrument flight rating, and you have to file a flight plan with the FAA in order to get into Class A airspace. Class B, it's this upside down wedding cake right here. This is terminal airspace. It's tiered altitudes, so up to 10,000 feet above the ground. And this is typically located around the busiest airports in the country, the hubs. So LAX is Class B, Washington, D.C. has Class B, Dallas is Class B. And in order to go into Class B, you have to receive a clearance from an air traffic controller. Moving on down, Class C, it's again an upside down wedding cake, just with one tier removed. These tiered altitudes are up to 4,000 feet. Typically these are around slightly smaller airports than the hubs. These are around the spokes, for example. Norfolk is a good example of Class C airspace. In order to get into Class C, you have to have two-way communication with an air traffic controller. Class D, again, surface to, we've just removed another tier, right? So it's surface up to roughly 2,500 feet above the ground. Again, you have to establish and maintain communication with an air traffic controller in order to get into this airspace. And again, this is usually around smaller spokes, again with a control tower. So C and D are spokes, B is a hub. A good example of Class D is Newport News Williamsburg is Class D airspace, right around it. Now we get into some of the fun ones. Class E, I'm going to read the definition verbatim and see if it makes as much sense to you all as it does to me. Airspace between classes A, B, C, and D, between the ceiling of B, C, and D and the floor of A. All right, so basically it's all the airspace that's not part of A, B, C, or D, or G. So this is basically, this airspace exists as the transition from terminal airspace, B, C, D, and E if it's a non-towered airport, like in this example, up to Class A airspace. You have to have an instrument clearance to do this and maintain, or allows the instrument-rated pilots to maintain control from air traffic controllers. But you can also have a visual pilot who's not actually talking to a controller at all. It gives them access to this airspace as well, so they can fly kind of uncontrolled. And Class G is these little tiny airspaces down here at the bottom. Class G is it's a surface, from surface to either 7 or 1,200 feet above the air, depending on where you are, or above the ground, wherever you are, or to the floor of the overlying Class E. And Class G, the thing you can take away from that is it's totally uncontrolled. There's no controllers, no radar looking there. So let's look at the national airspace by the numbers. So on average, about 50,000 flights use national airspace services every day. That doesn't mean that 50,000 planes are talking to controllers. It could be that you are a little private pilot in your Cessna chugging along, but you've gotten your information about what the weather's doing from the service on the ground. That's defined as a NAS service. So let's look at some of the people, right? 14,500 air traffic controllers and managers, 4,500 aviation safety inspectors, and 5,800 technicians are required to operate and maintain more than 5,100 public airports, 600 air traffic control facilities, and in total, including all the navigational facilities and air service facilities, over 41,000 operational facilities. Now, here's the first time that word complex is going to come up. This is just looking at the infrastructure required to operate within the NAS. This does not include any of the pilots who are actually flying in the NAS. If they're flying for an airline, it doesn't include any of the dispatchers or gate managers, gate agents, schedulers, crew service, right? It doesn't include any of those folks. It doesn't include anyone at the airports in some cases. So some of the major airports are actually outside of the FAA. They have their own control. So there may be gate technicians there. There may be all the service and catering, all that. So that doesn't include any of those people in this list. So first primer on how complex this system can get. So in total, there's more than 71,000 pieces of ground equipment for comm, nav, and surveillance that range from radar systems to communication relay stations across the country, up in Alaska and Hawaii. So how do we describe today's system? Has anyone ever heard of a system of systems before? Raise your hand. A few folks, right? So the system of systems is defined as the viewing of multiple, dispersed, independent systems in the context of part of a larger, more complex system. So there's that word again, complex, right? So how is our national airspace system like a car, right? Let's look at some of the advances in modern automobiles today in terms of their safety systems, right? Collision impact warning systems, automatic braking, airbag deployment, the pre-tensioners on your seatbelt, cruise control, some of the automatic stopping and things like that, traction and stability control. All these things were designed independent of one another. They weren't taken into account. You know, the guys designing the traction control system aren't talking to the guys building seatbelt tensioners, right? However, because of the physics of the car and the actions of the driver, all of those systems have to operate together in a more complex system. Therefore, a car is a perfect example of a system of systems. And it's just not the safety things. You can look at all the engine performance, all the handling qualities, things like that. So how did the modern car become what it is today compared to what it was even 20 years ago. You have these better safety features, right? More efficient engines, improved suspension and dynamic control, things like that, right? Why did it evolve, right? Well, there was a want for power in engines, right? Everyone likes a nice big engine in their car. There was a desire for efficiency, right? We wanted our cars to be more efficient. There was a need for new technology, right? As new technology came on the market, car makers, automobile manufacturers were starting to incorporate that into their products. And then critical for safety, right? Think of how much safer cars are today as opposed to 20 years ago. It's worth pointing out this modern car, like I said, it's not a designed system of systems. There's no one guy sitting there designing the entirety of the car, all of its systems and subsystems. It's really exists in its current form for two things, safety and efficiency. Well, the NAS is the same, right? The NAS has evolved from what it was due to things for safety, accident prevention, and as a result of learning from our mistakes and accidents and crashes, and efficiency, all the advances in propulsion and powertrain and suspension and things like that happen in a car. Well, the NAS is more efficient now. There's better communication pipelines between some of the actors in the NAS. Aircraft, of course, are getting more efficient. And it's worth pointing out that an aircraft itself is a complex system of systems. So in the national airspace, you have a complex system of systems operating in tandem with another complex system of systems to create a complex system of systems. Right, so remember, I said the word complexity was going to be said a lot today. That's the big takeaway. So, speaking of complexity, this is an official FAA diagram of the simplified national airspace system, okay? I am not going to go into any of this, but this is what the system architecture of the NAS looks like. All of the systems and subsystems that the FAA operates today, or at least as of 2011, according to this diagram, are in here. So, like I said, notice we have a little airplane right here, right? It itself is a complex system of systems. And notice how piecewise it is, right? It's not like everything exists in one big block talking to another big block. Everything's very piecewise. That involves a lot of communication and a lot of procedures to get things right. So how did we get here? How did we get from 1903, the Wright brothers, a couple hours south of here, taking off in their flyer down in Kitty Hawk, to this, right? How do we get here? So in 1914, we had the first scheduled air service in the country. 1920, the first transcontinental flights started with U.S. mail services. Interesting note, their navigation system at that time was bonfires across the country. People would light large bonfires and it would guide the pilots at night from location A to location B all the way across the country. And some of these sites actually still exist today, especially if you go out in the Midwest, or even just Google it now, you can see a bunch of pictures. 1926, the Air Commerce Act of 1926 took effect, and that was really the first attempt at providing and setting air traffic rules and certifying pilots in aircraft, right? So that was the first big jump. However, prior to 1930, there really wasn't a need for an organized system of air traffic control. Most of the flying was done in visual flight rules, totally uncontrolled, didn't have to worry about a bunch of planes in the air at that time, and most of the flying was done in day. Generally speaking, C and B scene was the way of not hitting someone else, and that is still a rule on the books today for VFR, is known as see and avoid. Very little for VFR has been changed since those early days, worth mentioning there. So the first air traffic controller, we get to this guy, good old Archie League, right here. Archie would sit at the approach end of a runway with two flags, go and stop. And he would instruct aircraft to land using those flags. All right. He had a nice little beach chair and these flags he packed in a wheelbarrow you can see in the background here, and he'd wheel them out to the approach end of the runway and control air traffic that way. And that was up in St. Louis. So the flags were hard to see in the fog, as you could imagine, so he transitioned over to light guns, right? He had this big flashlight looking thing, and he would shine a light, and 1 flash for go, 2 for no go. Again, little tidbit worth mentioning. Most air traffic control towers in this country still have light guns in their facilities today. At the same time, aircraft developers are starting to really generate these new radical at the time aircraft, the DC-3, the Super Constellation up there, the Lockheed. Airplanes are getting faster and flying higher, and there's more of them. In 1930, modern air traffic control, as we know it, was born in Cleveland, Ohio. There was a big controls tower that was up on top of an old hangar, and they used radios for the first time to communicate with aircraft in about a 15 nautical mile radius around that hangar. In 1934, the Bureau of Air Commerce was created. That's important to know. 2 years later, they developed the first rules for instrument flight rules and the first jet routes in the country. Of course, they weren't known as jet routes at the time, but they were really the first highways in the sky, for lack of a better term, for aircraft to navigate on. In 1935, air traffic control units created in Newark. Interesting note, they were actually owned by the airlines, and they weren't a government entity. Their responsibility was to separate traffic operating on those airways, those few airways, during instrument conditions. In 1941, they had airway traffic control centers for the first time. And we'll get into that term. It'll sound very familiar. Again, their main responsibility was to separate traffic on these routes. 1944, we move on, the birth of the jet engine, right? And we start moving forward. Again, planes getting higher, faster, more of them. So really the turning point in air traffic control happens in 1956. 1956, there was a very serious accident over the Grand Canyon. 2 airplanes collided over the Grand Canyon. And as a result of that accident, the U.S. government decided to heavily invest in air traffic control equipment, predominantly radar from the military at that time, so that now you had more coverage with these radars over the entire country, and you can actually start controlling where you knew the aircraft was. So prior to this, all the aircraft were handled by what's known as procedural control. The controllers would get position reports from the aircraft, and they would control the aircraft based on where they thought the aircraft was. Radar comes along, and now we can actually start to control where the aircraft actually is. 1958, the FAA is formed. Can anyone else guess what happened in 1958 that would be important for you to know while you're here? Yes, NASA was also formed that year. 1958 was also another big year. It was the first year that more passengers crossed the Atlantic by aircraft rather than steamboat. 1961, we had Project Beacon. Project Beacon recommended the first computerized displays for air traffic control. So now you're turning those radar sweeps into an actual display for a controller to look at. The aircraft then were required to carry transponders, which they still carry today. Secondary radar that actually identified the aircraft and gave an altitude report. So in 1960, of course, we had this huge boom, and since then in commercial aviation, the Boeings started really taking off, no pun intended, with the 707 and 727 and on to the 7345, etc. And now air travel is starting to become the way to go, right? For international travel, we're flying on airplanes rather than sailing on ships. For domestic flights, we're starting to fly more than drive. But it's worth noting, all those advances in aircraft technology from, let's say, the 60s to the 2000s, on the air traffic control side, not much changed during that time. There were some new upgrades. with Traffic Collision Avoidance System, TCAS, mandate in the early 90s. There were upgrades, of course, to the radar and the displays, but really not a whole lot changed in the paradigm of air traffic control in that period. So, today, in the 2000s, most of you have probably heard the term next gen. Show of hands, anyone heard of next gen before? All right, so next gen is the next generation air transportation system. It was a big push by the FAA and the US government. Again, kind of very similar to Project Beacon, we need to modernize our national airspace system. Let's come up with the times, start leveraging that new technology. Basically, because of the efficiency and especially the safety benefits that it has. So that's where we stand today. We're in the midst we aren't, the FAA is in the midst of deploying all these next-gen technologies. Aircraft owners and airlines are adopting the technologies on board their platforms, although somewhat reluctantly in some cases. But we're in the next big sweep of air traffic modernization right now. So let's talk a little bit about air traffic control and air traffic management. So why do we have controllers? What is their main job? So directly from their textbook, the Controller Bible, their purpose is to prevent a collision. That is number one, a priority right there. Number two is to organize and expedite the flow of traffic. Excuse me. So with NextGen, we are taking a large step in this second bullet, the expediting the flow of traffic. If you want more information, I am not an air traffic control expert. I'm not an air traffic management expert by any stretch of the imaginations. But if you're interested in what NextGen is doing, I'll give a little insight to it towards the end of the presentation. But by all means, come see me. I can get you in touch with the person that would have all the answers for you. And within limitations, providing additional services, things like weather reports, things like what is other traffic doing that's not a safety event. So each controller is responsible for a section of airspace known as a sector, or they work on the ground, again, in kind of a ground sector, and they work in an air traffic control facility. So what are those facilities? Centers, TRACONs, towers, oh my. All right, so let's start with the one that probably everyone knows, everyone thinks of, right? Air traffic control towers. These are at the airports, right? Air traffic control towers are responsible for delivering traffic to and ultimately accepting traffic from TRACON facilities, which we'll cover next. It covers the ground, the runway, and then the immediate vicinity of major airports with a control tower. And if you want to break it down by phases of flight, they're really responsible for taxi, takeoff, and landing. So the next facility, Terminal Radar Approach Control, or TRACON, their job is to accept traffic from and deliver traffic to the tower, as well as accepting traffic from and delivering it to the center, which we'll talk about next. So these are located around major airports. Some of them are consolidated. So if, for example, you go up north, DC has a consolidated TRACON facility known as Potomac TRACON that handles traffic for all the airports in the DC metro area. And again, if you break it down by phase of flight, they're really responsible for the departure and the arrival and approach. So finally, remember that Airways Traffic Control Center? That morphed into what's known as the Air Route Traffic Control Center, or simply put, the center. And they're responsible for accepting traffic from and delivering traffic to a TRACON facility. These are large sections of airspace over the entire United States and even oceanic. And they're mainly responsible for en route and the early part of the arrival phase of the aircraft. So here's just a little schematic of where all the centers are. We're in DC Center here. What this doesn't show, New York Center there controls traffic for a good bit out into the Atlantic Ocean. And Oakland Center here controls a lot of traffic out in the Pacific Ocean. So those aren't specifically shown on this chart. So let's go through an example flight.
What happens when you pass up in the
Excellent question. That you go into Canadian airspace at that point, and Canada has its own national airspace system, as it were, and you are actually handed off very similar. And we're going to go through a little exercise here, but you're handed off into to a Canadian controller, very similar to how you would be from one sector in the United States to the other. Great question. So let's look at an example flight. LAX to BWI. So Baltimore, Washington, for those of you who aren't familiar, and LA, of course. And let's look at an ideal trajectory across the country. This flight, again, complexity, is managed by 30 air traffic controllers and 11 air traffic control facilities. So this one flight is talking to that many folks. The FAA here has a great website that I highly recommend if you're interested in this, that literally walks through step by step. But we're actually going to do that right now. So I need 11 volunteers. If not, I'm just going to start picking people. Alrighty? So come on up. We'll count them as you come up. I actually need 12 if we want to pilot. So let's stand in front of the stage here, or right off the stage in front of that poster. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Come on, I need 5 more. 8, 9, 10. Come on, 2 more. Yeah, you two right up front, man. Actually, no. One of you sits. My student's going to come up. Actually, both of my students are going to come up. Alrighty, so let's make Zach the pilot here on the end. All right. So Zach's the pilot of this flight. All right, let's spread out a little bit. Zach, you can kind of stand in front of him. Chase, come on down. Come on down, guys. Spread out. Spread out. Alrighty, there we go. So Zach, go ahead and stand in front of Chase. You're at the gate at LAX, and you've just contacted LAX ground tower controller to get your permission to taxi from the ramp to the runway. He clears you and is going to take off by instruction from the LAX controller in the LAX tower. All right. So once you're cleared to take off, you come up. Chase or someone in his facility is going to instruct you, hand you off to the TRACON controller. So move on over to the next guy. All right. Now you're at the TRACON facility. You're at Southern California TRACON. All right. TRACON's going to tell you to go ahead and climb up to 17,000 feet and hold there. Then he's going to tell you to contact the first controller over in ZLA. All right, so we've moved over from LAX Tower. There's 2 controllers there. SoCal TRACON, there's 2 there. Let's move over to ZLA, all right? So there's 4 controllers that this aircraft is going to talk to in LA. So the center controller is going to clear you up to 23,000 feet. Once you get up to 23,000 feet, that controller is going to hand you off to the next guy. Nope, you're still in the same facility. All right, so he's going to hand you off to the next guy, clear you up to cruise altitude. All right, hand you off to the next guy and the next guy, and now you've made it to Albuquerque Center. All right, so again, we can just keep playing through this, right? So there's 3 folks in Albuquerque Center you're going to talk to. Move on over to the next one. There's Denver Center. 5 sectors are going to pass through in Denver Center. Next one, 3 in Kansas City Center. Next one, 3 in Indianapolis Center. Next one, 2 in Cleveland Center. Next one, 2 in DC Center. All right, so the DC Center controllers are going to start your approach. They're going to start you on the arrival into BWI. So they're going to tell you to descend down to 15,000 feet. And once you get there, go ahead and move to the next one. You're contacting Potomac TRACON. All right, so you're going to talk to a feeder and a final controller at Potomac TRACON as you come in. So you're on the second to last one. Finally, you're going to get within about 5 miles of the runway or so, and now you're going to be talking to the tower controller. All right, the tower controller is going to give you clearance to land. You're going to land, and then the ground controller at BWI Tower is going to instruct you how to taxi back to the gate. All righty? Everyone, thank you. Thanks Have a round of applause for our volunteers. So again, the word complexity, right? Zach's plane that he's piloting just talked to 30 people on a pretty routine flight, right? No big issues, just flying across the country. Weather pops up in the middle of the country, all right? Now you're talking to multiple controllers and making radio calls, potentially getting deviations around the weather, all right? Anything else pops up, you're putting what they call an air hold, right? A nice little racetrack pattern in the sky because there's congestion at BWI or even in Potomac Tracon, or even just in DC Center. You may be talking to more controllers. And mind you, this example just had one pilot talking to one controller. It does not include all the folks that controller is talking to in the background, the traffic management units. All those folks are coordinating with the Air Traffic System Command Center up in right outside of DC, right? It's not including all the folks that the pilot's talking to back at his airline, right? So he's talking with dispatch, he's talking with his cabin crew, he's talking dispatch, right? Dispatch is talking to all the operations folks. It's not talking about all the gate agents that need to get in place. What happens with this plane's 20 minutes late and the next crew, they time out, right? All the coordination that happens, right? So we're starting to get into the real complexity of the system. Just in this simple example highlights how complex this really is.
Are these controllers anticipating that flight, or do they only know about the flight once it's passing into their airspace and is transferred?
So they have a little bit of a heads up. There is a handoff procedure, so a controller will hand off a flight to another one prior to the aircraft establishing radio contact with him. Right, so the controllers are talking, these guys are sitting in big rooms at a center facility or a TRACON. They're often sitting close to one another. They're chatting with each other. So they'll say, hey, I'm going to hand you off United 123. So this controller's looking at his scope. He says, okay, United 123 is just outside of my sector and he's about to come in, so I should be listening for a radio call from United 123 any minute now. Great question. So, the national airspace today, let's look a little bit towards the future, all right? It's extremely safe, all right? The last major U.S. accident that we had with a hull loss, I mean, we totally lost the airplane and a high loss of lives was 2009, the Colgan air disaster up in outside of Buffalo. Before that, 2006, and then 2001 before that. However, the NAS is approaching its capacity limits. More aircraft are taking off and landing. And when you think about capacity, right, you look outside and it's not like the skies are totally black with aircraft flying over top of us, right? Capacity is determined by the constrained resources, right? The runways. There just isn't that much pavement and it's so expensive and there's so much paperwork and procedures and policy to go through just to put an additional runway at an already existing airport. That it's not necessarily feasible just to say, well, build more runways. The sky is not that crowded overhead, so how do we take that into account? The NAS has to be more integrated, reliable, robust, and adaptable. So I'm going to break each one of those down. Integrated, right? So we showed how each facility was separate, right? The 11 different facilities here. There is some integration between them, but not a whole lot. If you go back to that simplified NAS diagram, you could see how piecemeal a lot of the technologies were that exist today in the NAS. There's technological barriers from getting those systems to talk to one another. There's policy, there's politics, which of course is in everything. And the architecture, really that system architecture lacks integration across a wide number of components, which of course leads to more difficult a time for folks who are decision makers, right? How do you make these decisions without all the information? These are uncoordinated decisions. Reliable, all right? How many folks in here have been stuck on a plane with no reason why? Right, no reason given. Raise your hands. Right? Yeah, so that happens to most of us who fly today, right? You don't really know why you're being delayed. In some instances, take a great example, fog in San Francisco can delay flights back in Dulles on the East Coast, right? So you have a weather phenomenon on the extreme West Coast backing traffic up all the way across the country on the East Coast. Again, it's a capacity thing. Delays associated with air traffic management are estimated to cost somewhere between $14 billion and $18 billion a year. So that's billion with a B. That's a lot of money. Let's look at robust, all right? How many of you remember there was a big fire up at Chicago Air Route Traffic Control Center a couple years ago? You guys remember that? All right, that closed down Chicago Center for days, weeks actually. Think of how much money was lost because just one piece of one system went down, or several pieces because of the fire, but these several pieces all in a technology cabinet, right, go down because of a fire and we lose that entire sector and the ability to control traffic over that massive airspace, right? Let's look at a closer example, right? Robust. So, and David was on my flight back from Denver, all right? So those of us who went out to the AIAA Aviation Conference in Denver this past summer, coming back, our flight gets canceled due to an engine issue with the airplane, which in retrospect was probably a good reason to cancel the flight. None of us were happy at the time, but in retrospect, not a bad thing. However, found out from some folks coming home the next day who were supposed to be on that airplane, because of course airplanes fly, right? So it was supposed to fly from Denver to Charlotte and back to Denver and pick up another load the next morning and fly back. Well, they were supposed to be on that airplane. Guess what? That airplane's down. That flight got canceled. So now you're looking at passengers getting rebooked to new flights, right? And now you're causing this massive ripple effect because it's not robust, right? There was no mechanism to get a new plane there from the airline's perspective, right? There was no mechanism for air traffic control to schedule more flights or the airline to schedule more flights, right? So look at the robustness, this massive ripple effect because of one thing, right? And that's one airplane at one airport. And how many airports were there in the country? All right, 5,100 airports, not all of them major, of course, like Denver is, but you could guess at the same time that there was probably an issue at Dallas with a plane, right? There was probably an issue at San Francisco with a plane, for example. So think about all these massive ripple effects and the problems that they cause. And then look at adaptable. Adaptable, how many of you have a drone, quadcopter? Right, so you know that the FAA made you go through a registration process a couple years ago, right? Just to fly that thing in a park near your house. The current airspace technologies and procedures aren't really adaptable to these new emergent users, especially when it comes to UAS. How long is it taking the FAA to come up with a plan for how to integrate these in the national airspace, especially the small ones, right? And that's not a knock on the FAA. It's a very difficult task, but it should be more adaptable to these, especially at the pace that technology is moving today. It should be a lot more adaptable. So in order to achieve these operational efficiencies and all the things that we've mentioned here, the users really want flexibility. And they've stated as much. Down here, this quote, we need to be completely change our approach to the way the system will function in the 21st century, right? So this is taking a holistic view of how the system is going to work, and that was from the Joint Planning and Development Office, who is responsible for the next generation air transportation system. So how are we going to get there? Well, I talked about procedure-based control, right? That was in the early days, we're controlling where we think the aircraft is based on position reports. We then moved to surveillance-based control, right? So now we're controlling where we know the aircraft is. And we're still doing that today, even as radar is being overcome by new technologies, satellite-based technologies, and GPS-based technologies. So where do we go in the future, right? trajectory-based management, all right? So now we can actually control where we know the aircraft will be in the future, right? So think about the strategic planning that can occur in order to make the system more robust, more adaptable, right? Think about how many more airplanes you may get in the sky or land on a given runway or take off from a given runway with that strategic-based planning in mind to address the capacity concerns. All right, so the future of the NAS is probably going to look something like this, right? So you have a bunch of vehicles. You have kind of the traditional ones. You have the supersonics. How many folks, anyone working supersonics in here? Really, supersonics brought on no interns this year? Wow. Okay. Okay. So supersonics, the low boom flight demonstrators coming up, which is pretty exciting. We have large UAS and biz jets and general aviation, and here we got these little small UAS drones. Amazon delivering whatever you want, Prime Air, right? So we at NASA and pretty much the community at large envision a NAS that has safe, robust, integrated being the big term, and collaborative being the secondary big term there, operations that are using these trajectory-based technologies and procedures. All right. The future state of the NAS will improve efficiency and airspace capacity. All right. So now we're talking about what we're striving for: integrated, seamless access for all airspace and all users. All right. Looking at scalability, making the system scalable. So if you have something like what happens up in Chicago where an entire center goes down, you have a backup center somewhere, or you have personnel at the surrounding centers who are seeing the same information that Chicago Center was, so you don't have to shut down an entire chunk of airspace. How do we get more airplanes in the sky, right? A wide breadth of users. There's going to be a lot more people flying, right? So how do we scale our system to match that? And then flexibilities for users and for disruption management. So I talked about the weather disruptions. That's just one example of a delay. Flexibility for users, having the users of the airspace, the folks actually flying the planes, have a little bit of say in what's going on, or a little bit more than they do today. And collaboration through integrated real-time information management, right? So a common picture of what's going on with a given aircraft, both for the flight crew and the controller and everyone that's on the periphery of that exchange. All right. So what does NASA do here? We've been involved in comm, nav, and surveillance R&D for 70 years, probably over 70 years at this point. We've had a fairly specific role in the modernization of the national airspace for about 30 years. Includes both ground-based automation and flight deck automation. So what are we doing now? Well, there's 3 major projects right now. We're going to go through each one of them. So we have the ATD project, Airspace Technology Demonstration, and we're looking at advanced technologies for arrivals over here, if I can. So here's ATD-1 looking at arrivals. ATD-2 looking at an integrated arrival, departure, and surface operation concept. And then ATD-3 looking at what's known as applied traffic flow management. Trajectory-based operations is the second one, right? So this is a big bread and butter for NASA. We've been preaching trajectory-based operations for several years. Most, if not all, the technologies that are in the Airspace Technology Demonstration Program are trajectory-based technologies. Again, moving for that paradigm shift towards trajectory-based management rather than control. And looking at the safety, right? Real-time system-wide safety assurance. Again, talking about that integrated, on-demand information about how safe is the NAS, and can we start to identify any of the precursors prior to an incident happening. So with that, I'll conclude. We've got about 5 minutes for Q&A. Like I said in the middle of the talk there, I'm not a self-proclaimed air traffic management expert. However, I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Oh man, come on, tough crowd. But there are a lot of folks in my branch who specialize in several facets of this. And so if you want to know more, if you're super interested, feel free to shoot me an email. Give me a call. You guys are local. Call me on center, 43645 if you're that interested. And I can either try to answer the question myself, or if I don't know the answer, I'll definitely put you in contact with folks that would. Any questions?
So what if the plane come over a really large body of water? Would you focus on that?
So that's a great question. The question for those of you in the back, if you couldn't hear, what happens if a plane goes over a large body of water, for example, the Pacific? Who's responsible for controlling that? So like I mentioned, Oakland Center out on the West Coast controls a lot of the Pacific Ocean. So if you're flying from LAX to Honolulu, for example, you're talking to Oakland Center for the en route portion of that flight before you start to talk to Honolulu, Tracon, and Tower. Once you start to fly over towards Asia, at some point you'll stop talking with Oakland Center, and you'll start talking with whatever country owns that airspace. So it could be the Japanese, I believe, own a good amount of airspace. The Russians own a lot of airspace there. So similar to flying into Canada, you're just going to get handed off from a U.S. Air route traffic controller to a Japanese or Russian en route air traffic controller.
Would it be fair to assume that a lot of foreign nations have the same similar setup for their air traffic control as far as the integration of the levels?
That's a difficult one to assess. So there are a few more there are a few countries who are a little bit more advanced in some of their surveillance and comm capabilities that we are. The Europeans have instituted what's known as datacom, or at least they have a mandate out to institute that for basically replacing certain voice communications with text communications. The Australians are way ahead of us in terms of their implementation of the satellite-based navigation. Interesting note there, it's because they didn't have the need to set up large radar facilities in the middle of the outback. So this being a space-based GPS technology, they didn't have to replace any infrastructure. They were implementing it in a lot of areas for the first time. So every country has its kind of pros and cons. But I don't know the specifics on things like UAS, for example, and these kind of new entrants. I don't know the specifics on other countries or other agencies' policies. Welcome.
You mentioned a lot that it's a capacity type issue going forward. Naturally, it's easier to expand, employee numbers than it is to add new runways to an airport. Over the next 20 years, where do you see the capacity expanding the most? That's going forward.
Well, so at that, if the question, as I understand it, is about if you can just add more airplanes or add more people to add more people to the back of an airplane, or to add more flights.
So to add more flights. So if the system's going to grow as a whole, where is it going to be? Where's the bottleneck going to be? The
bottleneck's always going to be the runway. Always going to be the runway. There's just planes. It's aviation has a 100% track record. Whatever's gone up has come down, right? In one way, shape, or form. You have to land, right? You have to take off. You have to land. There are new technologies. In fact, we're leading a big effort here in distributed electric propulsion that are vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, right? So maybe you don't need the traditional runway. You can take off from something more like a helipad, right? Which is a lot less infrastructure than a new runway. But the constraining factor is always going to be the runway. Any more questions? Great question. So yes, radar has its limitations, right? So there are large areas of, and not just the Pacific Ocean, but large areas of the world where there is no radar coverage. And that's why the space-based surveillance technologies, ADS-B being the prime example, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, to spell out the acronym. They're space-based, right? So they're satellites. So there's a lot of work going on. I know Inmarsat has come out lately with a new space-based, actually internet-based ADS-B, where they can get the position of an aircraft that's hooked up to their in-flight internet at any time, regardless of location around the world. But yes, there are large chunks. A lot of what happens out in the oceanic airspace, and I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I do know that a lot of it is still procedural control. Like for example, if you're flying from LAX to Honolulu, you're at 40 miles behind the guy in front of you, just for procedural control because there's no radar out there. So yes, that is a big concern. Any other questions? All right, and like I said, if you guys want to go in depth on any more of this, especially with what we're doing now and where we're looking towards the future, go ahead and contact me. And if I don't know the answer, I'll make sure to put you in contact with someone who does. All righty. Thank you all for your time and attention.